I've been on a bit of a World War II kick at the moment, trying to find a lot of the old Steam games in my library that came out as World War II FPS titles. CSGO Killers, Day of Infamy Pretenders, and, well, I think I've found the best one. Days of War has been in my Steam library since 2017 on its early access release. In January, it came out, and by March, well, it was as dead as a dodo. And I think it is one of the most interesting stories of how a developer themselves can destroy a title without all that much. In 2016, there was a Kickstarter. This Kickstarter did fairly well, actually. It raised almost $70,000 of a $20,000 goal. How they're expecting to make a game on $20,000, I'm not entirely sure, but hey, they wanted it anyway. Talking about giving us early access, the British forces, the Russian forces, all of that was funded. And Days of War soon came out into early access. It was a class-based shooter set in World War II, very much setting itself up to be the next fast-paced FPS within the Second World War. What first attracted a lot of people was this video that came out of these 100-player battles in Days of War. There was a trailer where they brought out Omaha Beach. It was almost like a Hell Let Loose, slightly before a Hell Let Loose, promising 100-player battles. Yeah, okay, we'll get back to that in a little bit. Releasing in early access for $25, all of a sudden, people realized there were some issues. Okay, it's set on Unreal 4, so it kind of looks okay, but it feels, in terms of its gameplay, a bit dated, broken, and bland. Especially when there's games like Red Orchestra 2 and Day of Defeat Source out at this point in time. Even Hell Let Loose is on its way. I don't know if this really had a place. At launch, Days of War was 16 or 32 class-based games. The factions contained Americans, British, Germans, and Russians, and all having their own period-accurate weapons. Whether you're playing as the Assault class, as the Americans, you get the Thompson. You can even play as rocket launcher classes, which, as I'll get into in a little bit, doesn't really make too much sense with the type of game they were going for, but hey, it is what it is. Why is this a class in what? A competitive game? Whose idea was this? I mean, fair enough. Oh my god. This is insanity. Hello. And people thought it was fine. Mixed reviews because of the lack of content and the kind of steep price tag, even for 2017. But there was potential. I mean, after all, this was an early access game, and it was 2017. The peak of early access, where people still thought games would be finished. Remember, they raised almost $70,000. There's no way these guys would give up on their title anytime soon. Yet within a month, the game was taken down from Steam. Why? Well, there was a Donner map on Days of War, and apparently it was just a straight copy of a map from Source, as in Day of Defeat Source, the game that Valve owns, along with the platform that Days of War was published on. So yeah, as you can tell, Valve weren't too happy about that, but they sorted it. Admittedly, there was only 4 maps on launch, basically no other content. Now there were 3 maps, but they were going to do something about it. The developers, look, they were going to make sure this game was going to be a success. However, this wasn't the end of their issues. Invisible walls plague this game. It prevents you from jumping onto bits of terrain. I ended up just falling off bits of roof thinking that I could jump over. Running speed is a bit too fast, but not only that, you seem to run out of stamina in about 2 seconds flat. Your guys really do need to get asthma tests. And some of the death animations are absolute insanity. Okay, it might seem cool getting sniped in the head and your top of your skull falls off, but it seems so out of place in this type of game. Whoa! I had no idea that happened. Everything else is very cartoony with a few blood splattered, and then all of a sudden you've got this horrific gory death, which doesn't make any sense. It's complete excessive gore within a game that has not promoted itself as that. And don't get me wrong, I play Hell Let Loose all the time. People get limbs blown off constantly, but that's what that title is for. It's for immersion. It isn't some strange, fast-paced CSGO clone. Speaking of CSGO, by the way, after the game launched in early access in 2017, there was about 800 people playing it. Okay, it wasn't great, but fairly healthy. Enough people to fill up servers. 2 months later, less than 100. Another month after that, less than 50 players, which for multiplayer only is almost a death sentence. And that player base didn't even go up until the release in 2020 Yes, 3 years later, they actually released the game. There was a slight peak in player base, but that was about it. They then tried to revive it in February of 2020 with a free weekend, still only hitting about 150 players. And then towards the end of 2020, it settles at around 5 concurrent players. Not exactly that healthy. But why was this? Well, when the game launched, for starters, it just didn't really have a place or direction. On release, it was this fast-paced World War II game with these classes, maps, bots, to play against. Actually, on release, it didn't have bots. We'll get onto that later on. But the developers soon wanted to transition this into a CSGO World War II variant, I guess. I mean, you can see the bare bones nature of that. It is incredibly fast-paced. You can see some competitive sides to it. You can see how people could catch on to this as almost a World War II variant of Counter-Strike. Yet, the way they went about it was absolutely awful. For starters, they took out ADS, aiming down sights. Or a horrific idea. Great, CSGO doesn't have that, and for one specific reason, because it's very much focused on tactical shooting, fast-paced competitive gameplay. The problem is, CSGO has this thing called spray patterns. Every gun will spray in exactly the same, or moreover exactly the same way, meaning that players can get used to the arc, whether it's a T or up to the right, that sort of thing, and you can get good at using these weapons in such ways. Days of War never had that. They didn't introduce any sort of spray patterns, which means that if you take out ADS, how do you learn to shoot a gun? They've literally taken out aiming for a first-person shooter. That is not a joke. Also, the recoil was bumped up to about infinity. This clip is awful. Wait, I can only... Whoa! Whoa! So there we have it. Aiming removed from a first-person game. Made it almost impossible to get any sort of good gameplay from. That made people incredibly angry. And even back in 2017, when people complained about this, the devs had a fantastic response. Play another game. That genuinely, the developers of Days of War told people to play another game if they didn't like ADS removing. And actually, kind of smart of them, people listened. People went to play anything but Days of War, judging by how fast that player base dropped off. We've seen from titles like Battlefield 5 with developers coming out getting angry at their own community. It is never a way of growing something. And especially if you don't have the facilities for that big man, which Days of War definitely did not. It wasn't just this though. Trying to be some sort of a competitor to CSGO, or at least work alongside it, there was no competitive mode. That is not a joke. They've taken out aiming and they haven't added in a competitive mode to a competitive first-person shooter. Am I going insane here? Are these not the two things that you need when you're deciding? Even to this day, after the full release, competitive mode is still not in. It just says coming soon on the menu. And of course, it is not going to be coming. This game is being completely abandoned. This was supposed to be a competitive first-person shooter. Just let that sink in. It doesn't have aiming. It doesn't have a competitive mode. It has classes like Rocket Launcher and MG that are completely useless on the types of maps. Even Sniper to some extent. These maps are so small, there was pretty much no use of them at all. It was the 100-player battles that attracted people to this game, almost making it look like a Hell Let Loose competitor. And then when they got into the game, it was, well, what you can see on screen, which I think is such a disappointment because the potential here was, well, it was something special. A World War II competitive FPS? What more could you want? I, for one, really want something like this. Because even to this day, there just really isn't in any shape or form. It can still be bought on Steam for $25. And it has no servers. Okay, it has 3, but no player base. And so you're pretty much stuck with playing against bots. These are the types of games that have just been left to rot on Steam. And honestly, should probably be taken off because people are going to be buying this thinking it's some cool first-person shooter, and sure, you could say you're an idiot if you don't do your research, so watch this video first. But still, the possibility that someone could waste their money on it is awful. It should be taken off Steam. They fully released the game in 2020, and then they stopped any communication within the same year, meaning that they'd seen the writings on the wall. From March of 2017, the player base started dying off. It then limped over its release line 2.5 years later, and, well, still was a complete disaster with no real effect on the player base. Sure, they got it through the finish line just to say we released it, but it was a studio without any vision. It was ditched and abandoned, and it just felt like a quick cash grab. That's what most of the Steam reviews are saying now. They felt like they were robbed, even though, even to this day's standard, it's still not an incredibly expensive game, but it just didn't really do anything. Supposing to be a remake of Day of Defeat Source, it just felt like everything was worse. A $25 game with no content, with reports of it even damaging computers due to major blinking and screen flashing glitches. A game that is bugged up the wazoo, where you can't get around certain parts of your own map. A game that was advertised as a huge 100-player war on Omaha Beach, and it never really lived up to that expectation. Small first-person shooter maps, fast-paced running with no aiming, and no competitive gameplay. What more could you want from a game? I don't know. Honestly, I really don't know.